Welcome to the third and final day of the 28th Annual Conference of the European Network of Advisory Councils on Environment and Sustainable Development, hosted this year from Dublin by the National Economic and Social Council. I'm Dr. Cara Gustenberg, your moderator for today, and also an environmental scientist, campaigner, and broadcaster. And I'm joined in studio by the director of NESC, Dr. Larry O'Connell. Good morning, Larry.
Good morning, Cara, and I'd like to welcome all of the members of the EEAC, our chair, Arnaud Queralt-Bassaus, and all of the speakers that will join us today, and all of you, the participants from all around the world that have joined us. I hope that you enjoy the proceedings this morning.
Thanks, Larry. Don't forget to continue putting your questions and comments in the chat function. And if you'd like to engage with the discussion on social media, the hashtags are EEAC28 or Just Transition, and you can tag at NESC Ireland or at EEAC_network to continue the conversation. Over the last few days, we've come together to talk about policies, practices, and processes of a just transition. And I hope you agree we've had some excellent, stimulating discussion from policy practitioners and experts from various perspectives and experiences. Larry, I was struck by just how many lessons we've already learned from specific communities and specific examples of making a just transition. What have you gotten out of the last couple of days?
Thanks, Cara. I think just three things struck me from the first 2 days. I think firstly, the sense of the ambition that's now there for a transformative vision for our economy, our societies and our environment, and the political commitment, and also I suppose crucially that there's funding now to support our attempts to achieve that vision. The second thing that came across for me was the importance of co-production. I think the real sense that this ambition now needs to translate down into action to support people in specific local contexts. And we heard quite a lot about how to do that and how we should do it. And the third theme that came across for me was this one of institutional learning. I think those local practices, the people at the cutting edge that are trying to develop new ideas, they need to feel that their institutions actively listen to the issues that they're facing and find ways to address them quickly.
All good points. Thanks, Larry. We are incredibly honoured to be welcoming the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to speak in about an hour. But first, we have a session exploring the role of dialogue and processes for a fair and inclusive transition. The effects of a required transition towards a sustainable Europe by 2030 will affect a broad variety of stakeholders, as we know. The processes and structures by which society, science, and policy connect have to be fair and inclusive, so as to bring everyone along, and to progress the sustainability and transformation agenda. In this session, we're going to focus on the role that advisory bodies and commissions and social dialogue can play in providing for participatory processes for a fair and inclusive transition to ensure that no one gets left behind. It's something that's come up repeatedly in the last couple of days. We also have some more creative surprises for you today. We'll get to listen to two fantastic creations by Tegan Ford and Laura Wolfe. The 2020 Irish Writers' Centre Writing for Change Flash Fiction is a creative non-fiction competition, and it's themed around the climate crisis. The competition is organised in partnership with the National Botanic Gardens and Channel. Writers were asked to embrace the concept of the climate crisis through short new pieces of contemporary writing that reflect or illustrate the climate crisis in an innovative and relevant manner. And this year, writers were asked to respond to the Mary Oliver quote, "Keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable." So first up, we have Laura Wolfe reading her winning piece from the Under 30 English language session.
Like you, as I grew, I began to notice something strange about the world around me. A strangeness that showed itself as grumbling threats to the order of things. Like growing up and getting a place of your own, of being able to get a steady job, things that everyone was supposed to be able to do. I know you felt these threats too. I know some of you can't even get enough nutrients from the soil because someone else took more than their fair share. I feel you. I sometimes wonder why people keep saying that things are changing. These changes started long before I took my first breath. Things have already changed. To me, there's two worlds, one imaginary and one real. One that I thought existed, one that maybe used to exist but doesn't anymore. And this world that I'm actually in, that is in danger of giving up. I get it. Sometimes I feel like giving up too. In this new, strange world, we're expected to last longer. I know you feel the pressure to bloom earlier because it's warmer, and you're expected to hang on to your leaves longer because it's warmer. It sometimes feels like it's hotting up for me too. Expected to do it all, have a great job and a family, and keep going longer and longer until I'm 66 because I can't afford a pension. There's pressure on me too. It feels like we still have to prove ourselves sometimes, you and me. We have to give this society, this city, this world, everything, just to feel worthy of it. Even though it's crumbling. Even though it isn't giving us what we need in return. You do so much already just by being. You clean the air we breathe, but that's not enough. We want to eat you, to chop you up and turn you into something more useful, to take the pretty ones inside to look nice, to cut you down and burn you because you're taking up too much space. Maybe you could tell me, if your roots have eyes, how many human heads you can see down there, buried in the sand.
Another really moving piece. Thank you so much for that. I'm delighted now to start this session and be joined by Peter Schmidt, the President for the European Economic and Social Committee for Sustainability, Agriculture and Rural Development and the Environment section. Arnaud Kuralt-Bassa, the Chairman of the EEAC Network. Luke Murphy, the head of the Environmental Justice Commission of the UK's progressive policy think tank IPPR, and Elif Gwendazili, Senior Coal Policy Coordinator for Climate Action Network Europe. I'm going to ask all of you to address the question, why are participatory processes so important for a just transition, and what commissions, councils and social dialogue bring to the table on this? And it's an issue that came up repeatedly at the start of the conference with respect to Sharon Burrow's contribution and discussion. So I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. Peter, if I could start with you to say a few opening words on that topic.
Thank you very much, Cara. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm happy to join this meeting and to give some input. Nobody told me how long I can speak, so this is good for a trade unionist like me, because we don't like that to be limited. So be aware on this. No, don't worry. So when you ask an official from the ESC how important are the participatory processes are. I mean, we are the house of the civil society, of the European civil society. And we think without involving the civil society in the just transition process, there will be no success on it. And for this, we have to address the policymakers with pushing them to address some issues. The first one is we are not happy with some decision-making processes because we are not involved structurally into this process. So we as civil society, the civil society we are not lobbyists. And that's why it's so necessary that we bring the civil society's perspective into this policy-making process. We see that in the current situation. We have a health crisis, we have a deep climate crisis, and we see that in all these processes, we are not involved. We are not really involved in this in the decision making process. Just give some points for the discussion. So, what is about the distribution process in our society? We see that now in the deep health crisis. So there is no mechanism where we could see that there will be in the future for the recovery and shift towards another economic system. What we need is a well-being economy which is driven by the well-being of the people, or not driven by the profit thinking of the big multinationals and of the big companies. So there is no mechanism. So when you talk to the policymakers, they just talk about, we have to build a resilient economy which is built on growth. And we as civil society think, no, it shouldn't be built on growth. It must be built for the well-being of the people. The second point, which is very, very important for this structured involvement, is that we involve the youth. We saw in the last years that they go to the street and they demand an structured participatory participation in this process. We, the ESC, we created and we produced an opinion on that, and we will do that in the future in the ESC. We will involve the youth. Third point is, I'm a trade unionist, and I experienced in my country, in Germany, how important it is that we have an structured involvement into decision-making processes. For instance, in the companies or in the factories, the more we involve the workers, the more they have a say, the better it is for the company and the better it is for the well-being of the people. So you have the better conditions in these companies where we have a respect on the fundamental rights rather than in other companies and where we have to fight for. So, and last point, what I want to address is, it is not about money. It is about distribution. And most of the people do not realize that the money-making process is on that high level that we shouldn't have a discussion about money, because the companies, they make the money. They are in the profit range on 20%, 15%. And this is not healthy. This is not healthy for a society. And this is not healthy for a just transition process, because we would need this money to transform the economy into a green and into a social economy. That's why I'm a little bit disappointed in the Commission's, let me say, wording. So they always talk about the Green Deal, a green transition. They never talk about the social transition. And I think before we talk about the green transition, we must talk about the social transition, because without involving the people, we will not have success in this process. So that's why we need at all levels, locally, regionally, nationally, and on the European level, a strong involvement of all necessary and all society groups for this decision-making process. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. 3 big changes, really advocating for system change, I think, there. Arnaud, I want you to come in now and just welcome you and thank you for bringing us all together as part of the network and the conference. But if you could give EEAC's perspective on this issue, that would be great.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Is it correct? Okay. So thank you, Cara, for this really interesting question. But before I start, I would like to extend my greetings to all of you watching, and especially to the colleagues in this panel. And I would like to congratulate Peter Schmidt for his recent election as President of the European Economic and Social Committee section for Agriculture, Rural Development and Environment. So, Peter, congratulations on behalf of the EEAC board. Cara, a just transition is worth pursuing, but it is also very complex. Let's face it, not everyone will directly benefit from the changes needed to achieve a sustainable Ireland and a sustainable Europe. Some sectors and therefore professions will change in such a way that this can have a negative impact on people's livelihoods, particularly in the short term. It is therefore important that a just transition is shaped that provides perspective to all. And to achieve this goal, it is of the utmost importance to ensure that you design participatory processes in which those affected by the transition are truly heard. It should be about talking with those involved, not talking about them. It is important. At this point, I think it's quite clear. If this inclusive dialogue is not well organized or it does not take place at all, people will, and rightly so, block or at least delay the much needed transition. This must and can be prevented. It's obvious, and inclusive dialogue and the joint design of real solutions are important to enable a just transition. Based, when you told me about the importance of the council, I mean, based on their composition, functioning, and mandate, the advisory councils, as represented in the EEAC network, have a role to play to ensure this inclusive dialogue and joint design of solutions. And first of all, let me start with the composition of councils. Councils, advisory councils, bring together the views of a broad range of stakeholders and disciplines. This variety of stakeholders deliver different opinions and ideas and represents different interests. But by bringing these parties together, councils are able to come forward with a nuanced, balanced, and well-informed views and solutions. And moreover, and I am referring now to expert councils, because you know that the network, the EEAC network, is composed by stakeholder councils and expert councils. But referring to the expert councils, the interdisciplinary and high-level scientific profile of their members also provide them with a deep, rigorous, transversal, and independent analysis and capacity of proposing recommendations on just transition mechanisms and initiatives. I mentioned composition, but then secondly, councils are a place where these stakeholders can strive to find common and shared solutions to these complex and long-term challenges. Through the very functioning of these councils, in our opinion, finding common grounds and building up on this these grounds is in the DNA of our institutions, and we think, and the ESC thinks, that it is really important, and only a broadly supported transition can be just. Third point, referring to your question, I would like to underline that the importance of the mandate given to our councils. I mean, by being the formalized advisors to governments and parliaments at the national and international level, councils on climate change, the environment, and for sustainable development have frequently been able to amplify and widen the role and influence of many partners of civil society. Also, through the link to political leadership, councils add weight to the political sounding usually provided by individual organizations or interest groups. And this is important to make sure, in our opinion, that the debate about a just transition does not only take place, but that those with executive power also hear its outcomes. This would be, from my perspective, the answer to this very important question. Thank you.
Thanks, Arno. That's a really good perspective and insight into the members of the EEAC network, actually, and their role in making a just transition. Luke, can I now turn to you to hear the perspective of the Environmental Justice Commission on this question?
Sure, and thanks very much for having me to speak to you today. I just want to say a little bit about our commission and then talk specifically about why we think it's important, this social dialogue. Talk a little bit about a few lessons on transitions around the world that we've learned, and also some key points on what we think some of that dialogue should look like. So first of all, just a little bit about the Environmental Justice Commission. It's a across UK commission, bringing together all parties and focused on putting people at the heart of the transition. And as part of the commission, we're running a number of citizens' juries across the UK, looking at areas where there are particular challenges and speaking to the community about what the kind of their anxieties are about the transition, but also about the opportunities. So we are really putting it at the heart of our work. And that kind of leads me on to the why we think it's important. And as the previous speakers have said, it's, the transition is going to affect every aspect of our lives, the way we live, the way we travel, and the way we work. Much of the progress made so far, certainly in the UK, but in many other countries around the world, in terms of decarbonising the economy, has been made through the power system. It's been done in the background. But going forward, we know it's going to affect, as I said, everything and every part of our lives. So it's right in itself that we have this social dialogue with civil society, with the local communities that are going to be affected, with unions, workers, with businesses. But that's not the only reason. We argue will it also be a better designed transition. Unions and workers know their industries better than anyone else. People know their communities better than anyone else, the local landscape, the priorities and their needs. So not only is it right in itself, but it will actually be a better designed transition with greater public involvement. But it'll also help tackle other challenges as well, because we think it will lead to a more holistic approach. I think, as Peter was saying, it's essential we don't just focus on the green, but also on the social. And I think by the wider the canvas of people you bring in and the stakeholders, it does mean you have a far more holistic approach. And then from the climate and nature transition, a big bonus for that is we believe it will happen faster. And this kind of greater social involvement and dialogue is not a barrier to the transition, but is actually a prerequisite to it. Without that dialogue, more mistakes are likely to be made, greater injustices are likely to be inflicted on certain communities, and indeed communities that have suffered injustices in the past and continue to suffer the greatest injustices from climate change. It's important that the transition doesn't do exactly that. And if you have this dialogue, we can ensure that we'll deliver a faster transition. So just on a few lessons from around the world, we've been looking at a number of transitions. We've held a series of events looking at the good and the bad of transitions. And we've kind of established 4 core learnings that I just wanted to share. One is the importance of developing a positive vision together with those stakeholders. So it can't just be about spelling out, moving away from a negative present or status quo. It must spell out positive alternatives and opportunities. Secondly, fundamentally, there must be engagement with the workers and communities who are affected for all those reasons that I just suggested. Thirdly, it's got to go beyond just consultation. Governments, businesses, unions, civil society, local communities and workers have to work together to co-develop and co-design these plans. It's got to go beyond consultation and actually be about the fundamental design of the plans as well. And finally, substantial funding is required, but is not a sufficient condition for a just transition. It must involve those previous 3 things: the vision, the engagement with the workers and communities affected, but also co-design and co-development as well. And just finally, I wanted to say a few things about key points about what the consultation, what the dialogue should look like. We think institutions are important. It formalises the process and can bring the stakeholders together in a really formalised way and institutionalise it within government policy making at all levels. So institutions are important. We've seen that with the Coal Commission in Germany. Scotland has set up a Just Transition Commission as well, and that work is well underway. Secondly, it must be inclusive. It's got to incorporate all partners from civil society, from unions, from workers, businesses too, and ensuring that we're also hearing from and that it includes historically marginalised communities. Thirdly, it must be meaningful. So the dialogue must be meaningful. It has to lead somewhere. I think the problem with just deliberation for deliberation's sake is if it doesn't go anywhere, it can lead to apathy. Actually, the recommendations, whether it be from a citizens' jury or citizens' assembly, where citizens have deliberated and made their recommendations, they can't just go into the ether. They must be taken forward. There must be an avenue for those recommendations to be taken somewhere. They must go somewhere. Finally, it must be ongoing. It must be ongoing consultation. It can't just be at the beginning or right at the end. It must be throughout the process and ongoing. We've got to build, just more generally, that social dialogue into our policy making system. And finally, and as I said, it's got to be about co-design as well. And actually, that's the best way of delivering the kind of transition we want to see. And as I said earlier, it will lead to a far more holistic approach, incorporating not just climate justice, but also social justice and economic justice as well. I think I'll end it there. Look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion.
Thanks for giving loads of practical tips there, but I particularly liked the first one, which is starting with that vision statement and building that with the local community. I think that's a really good place to start. Alif, last but not least, Climate Action Network Europe is Europe's leading NGO in fighting climate change. And personally, I found the analysis that comes out of CAN Europe really, really helpful in addressing climate action here in Ireland. So thanks from all of us here. What are your thoughts on this question of building partnership with communities and social dialogue in the just transition?
Hello, thank you, Cara, and thank you for inviting me to this session and the conference. I have been learning a lot of things in the last couple of days, so thank you so much. Being the last speaker in the opening is it has its pros and cons, but a lot of things have been said by previous speakers in a really good way. So I will try to fill some of the gaps from climate NGO perspective. Firstly, we agree that transitioning the economy towards climate neutrality and decarbonization cannot happen if a transformative, inclusive, fair, and bottom-up approach is not adopted. But another thing about just transition that requires local engagement and participatory processes is that definitions of just and transition that is so vague. And why this is vague is because it is justice, and the transition means what is needed for the local communities who are faced with a rapid transition. So inclusive participatory mechanisms at local level are important to first define who the impacted communities are, what kind of transformation is needed, what are the alternatives with more added values in those regions or localities, and how to make it just for various groups in one place. However, I would also like to mention something else about justice. In the context of ongoing climate crisis, people face not only the consequences of a rapid transition to low carbon sectors, but also consequences of climate change. In Europe, we have so many cases of farmers and firefighters, and so many different segments of the society who earn their livelihoods based on certain areas that get directly affected by the climate change. So when we think about a clean transition, and when we talk about just transition, I think we can and we should also start speaking about those communities and livelihoods as well. So there, for us, there in this just transition concept has three main groups of actors who get directly impacted by the climate crisis. So firstly, those that get affected by the rapid decarbonization that has started, and that will get faster and faster, as the previous speaker also mentioned. But secondly, the people who earn their livelihood on sectors that get directly affected by climate change, like beekeepers and the farmers, and so on. But also there are the communities who have been affected by the injustices created by fossil fuel and high carbon industrial facilities in the last decades. So obviously we now have this opportunity of making it a just transition for those communities as well, to help them move beyond the ongoing injustices, and they are the only people who can inform about those, and no one else can have a detailed idea on all of these that I just listed. Finally, the question on what kind of a transition. So what is clean transition? And this depends on what comes next to replace the fossil fuel infrastructure in a certain place, or a high carbon industrial facility in a certain place. That should also be decided with a bottom-up approach, but including communities, trade unions, but also civil society organizations working and experts working in various sectors. Like currently in the whole just transition fund and just transition mechanism debate, and the whole EU budget and how to use that for just transition debate, there is this huge political discussion around like what comes after coal, for instance. Is it gas or not? I mean, this is really high level talk, but when you look at the local level, one really has to consult. We shouldn't duplicate the mistakes that we have done in the past and bring something that would that would make people rely on dead ends, such as other fossil fuels or other high carbon industries that would be stranded assets very soon. And I will leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alip. I'll just ask a follow-up question to you, and then I'll bring that question to the other panelists too. Can you give an example where participatory process has worked with respect to engaging communities with climate change or environmental justice or sustainable development? And maybe, Alip, if you could answer that question, and then I'll go to Peter with the same question.
Sure, I actually do have an example from Slovakia. So the participation of civil society in monitoring of projects helped developing national sustainability criteria for biomass when using EU funds. And again, I'd like to repeat what I just said, that there is this, there are more and more stories as such when the civil society and local communities can get engaged in the management, in the planning of the distribution of the EU funds. Thank you.
Thanks. Peter, I mean, you gave us very high-level ideas on economic change and everything. Do you have any specific examples you can point to where we've seen some progress in changing those kind of systems?
Yes, of course, Cara. I have two examples. The one is the multi-stakeholder platform, which the Commission launched in 2017, and it was a huge involvement of the civil society. And we can say, I think, together with the other stakeholders, this was one of the factors that the Commission understood that they must announce the Green Deal. The problem is now what comes after that. So what we want to have is still unstructured involvement. The second example what I have is the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform. So this was an idea coming from my friend and colleague Cillian Lohan, by the way, an Irish colleague, with this opinion to establish a platform where the stakeholders in the circular economy can join, and on the European level, but coming from the local level over the national level, and we bring all the stakeholders, whether it is trade unions, the business sector, all together. And next week it is, I guess, the fourth platform. So this is what we organized together with the Commission, and this brings an added value in the process, because the politicians understand, the Commission understands then what is necessary and what are the obstacles. So these are two examples on the European level.
Thanks, Peter. And a comment coming in from the chat, which echoes the question that I've asked all of you, but it was coming from a member of the chat directly to Luke, saying that they really enjoyed your talk, and could you give some practical examples of the co-creative process and maybe difficulties in them and how they were solved?
Thanks very much. Yes, I mean, a couple. We as I said earlier, held a number of events over the course of this year online, obviously. Trying to learn some lessons, some good and the bad. I mean, I think the Lusatia region in Germany is an example where they created the Coal Commission in 2018 that involved the federal government, regional government officials, unions and industry representatives. And it was really designed around trying to reach a compromise that balanced decarbonisation priorities with support for workers in the region. Now, this didn't arise at the time out of, I believe, a kind of active process from the very beginning. It was actually, in some respects, a response to a backlash around existing proposals. But once the Commission was put in place, while the settlement is by no means perfect and it has been criticised, the settlement it did put forward did achieve some cautious backing from the regions and many of the worker groups. I think in Canada also there's an example of where there's been a lack of consultation of workers in plans for the transition, particularly around the tar sands. An organisation, a worker-led movement called Iron and Earth, actually was very successful, or relatively successful, in galvanising the workforce that it worked with to seek new low-carbon careers. This wasn't necessarily sponsored by the local government, but it shows the difference. They showed the difference that civil society, union, work organisations can have in achieving a fairer transition. Having said that, it was also recognised that perhaps some of the historically marginalised First Nation communities weren't quite as included in that. So while it helped some workers, it didn't help others. So I think in both instances, there were to take from the process, but also lessons to learn from them as well.
Thanks, Luke. That sounds like a really interesting study to explore more about. Arnaud, if I could come in there, I mean, everybody has talked about the need to include communities in a better way. So could you maybe talk specifically about what advisory councils and commissions and other formal bodies could do to widen the just transition debate and bring those people in?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you again for your questions. Allow me to start with the first part of your question. As I mentioned, councils like ours fulfill a very important role in the just transition debate, but we should pay special attention to the matter of representation. Are all those groups necessary to ensure a just transition represented, or at least heard by councils? Allow me to take the example of youth representation, and I just listen to what the point that Peter said about before in the previous intervention about youth in the European Economic and Social Committee. Nowadays many councils have youth representative embedded. However, that was not always the case, and I can imagine that this may go for more groups in society, as elders, for instance. There are many people, many sectors, many parts of society that should and could be represented there. We therefore need to make sure to continuously exercise critical self-reflection with regard to the composition of multi-stakeholder councils and the relation that expert councils establish with the stakeholders. And this is important to ensure that the debate about a just transition is truly broad and sufficiently deepened. And with regard to how our councils can ensure a balanced approach towards a just transition, I'm glad to say that it is in the very nature of advisory councils to push for a balanced approach that takes into account the different elements of sustainability, means people, prosperity, and the planet, really through the council's composition, functioning, mandate, and also through the partnership we have among our councils in the EEAC network, for instance. We should consider ourselves equipped to cater to the needs of a just transition.
Thanks, Arnaud. Alif, there's a comment or a question coming in from the chat specifically for you, looking for specific examples of what you mean by communities affected by the injustices of fossil fuel-based sectors or technologies and other high carbon systems. I'm sure you have lots of experience with that through CAN.
Well, I think we all know have experience.
Sorry, I mean the question was for Alif there, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question as well. Indeed, we have been, I work as the coal policy coordinator, so my examples will mostly come from the coal mining and coal regions in overall Europe and in the world. We have been, there are communities who have been living in coal mines for decades. And what is the thing about coal mines is that they have to expand and expand and expand. So people lose their lands to coal mines. People have lost their previous jobs as agriculturists or farmers to coal mining. So and of course, the air pollution and water pollution aspects that people have been suffering. This has been presented as a trade-off between income and a good, prosperous life. And this is the main injustice that these fossil fuel infrastructure. So these examples are from coal, but of course tar sands have been mentioned. Or if you can think of any other fossil fuel infrastructure or steel and iron production, etc. People have been losing their health and environment, and yes, their food sovereignty for these facilities. And I think this is also the time to get over these injustices and move towards that aspect that have been mentioned by the previous speakers. Is that the social pillar is extremely important in this sense, because if a green transition happens by putting new and again like socially destructive projects in the same places where people have suffered from previous high carbon facilities, then this is not going to be sustainable and it's not going to work for a longer term.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'm going to bring the next question to Luke. It's a question that came in from the chat, a little bit long here, but I'll read it out because I think it all has important points. In the case of global overheating, workers in the fossil industry, i.e. the diesel engine manufacturers, for example, can be accused of causing serious problems for others. How would you narrate their role to build and maintain political legitimacy for bailing them out with taxes that are paid by the others, which may see themselves as victims of fossil fuels and diesels? And I think Luke could probably answer this, and Peter, you may be able to come in on this too.
Quite a long question there. Thank you to the questioner for it. So I think if I've understood it right, I mean, I think I think whether it's I'd speak here more about the UK, I suspect, but I suspect that this applies elsewhere. In many of the heavy industries, so coal or automotive and manufacturing, quite often the role that type of work, and indeed for many people, plays quite a big role in the cultural and community identity of many places. And it's important, and I think it's important that we recognise that over the years it has, there has been many positives to aspects of different worker communities' work and the role that they've played in building prosperity in different regions in the UK and in other parts of the world. And I think it's in order to succeed as successful, deliver a successful transition, it's important that essentially that we take workers with us, and therefore, that, as I said earlier, we focus on that opportunity in the future and highlight how the skills that have been learned in the industries that are presently there can be used to kind of help deliver the low carbon transition. So whether it's oil and gas workers or those who work in the coal industry and their transferable skills to delivering renewables, the renewable industry, or housing retrofit, or manufacturing electric vehicles and the electric public transport, electric buses of the future. So I think the important thing is to tell a positive story that brings everyone together and outlines that everyone has a positive role in how we move forward, and not necessarily focus on the kind of the negative aspects, because at the end of the day, individual workers work in a wider system, and we need wider system change to help people move forward. And you can't blame people for putting food on the table for their family. It's let's set out a positive vision of how they can use their skills to deliver the low carbon transition in the future. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Luke. Peter, do you have anything to add to that? It seems a question relevant to some of the things you were calling for too.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Luke. I fully agree what you said. So we must stop accusing different groups of society, and say they are guilty because they work in a factory which pollutes the environment, or working in a in the food sector, which they produce food which is unhealthy. So it is not the people's choice. We have to see that when you live in an area with a high unemployment rate, people do not have any chance than, as Luke said, to bring the food on the table for their children. Mm-hmm. So this is not acceptable that we go this way. So what we have to do is, and this is the management's responsibility. The management take the choice what is produced, in which way it is produced. So that's why we have to turn that and saying, don't blame the people, but deliver or provide alternatives. So that means we must have an active labor market policy. That means we have to identify the issues. And Luke, you already mentioned in your first speech the German example on the coal coalition. They sat together and they made a plan for a long time. I'm not happy with 2038, no? So to be honest with this, but it brought a positive narrative to the people that then they have a hope. They know, okay, my family is in this area, they will get jobs, perhaps not a mining job, but they will get quality jobs and well-paid jobs. So this is what we have to do. That's why it is so important we have this civil society involvement. I mean, this is exact example, bringing all together and sit on a table and develop future plans with an overarching strategy. That's it.
Thanks, Arnaud. I saw you nodding a lot as Luke and Peter were talking. Do you want to come in there and give your own perspective on some of the things they were saying?
No, I think, I mean, I fully agree with Luke and Peter. I mean, it is important to give hope, to engage, to involve those people in the solution. I mean, we cannot say that we cannot blame people. I mean, the point is they are part of the solution. They are part of the solution. As scientists are also part of the solution. The point is how we engage, how we can create a space with enough legitimacy in order to make sure that we find solutions together. And this is the point. I mean, because the paper, I mean, everything on paper is fantastic, but we need to find real solutions. And this is why we need these spaces for co-creation, for looking for solutions all together. And this is a matter of joint responsibility, society, policymakers, and scientists. This is also important. And as I said before, those people are also in the core of the solution. And this is an important point from my side.
Thanks, Arnaud. I saw you kind of frowning as Peter mentioned the coal example in Germany, and there's a question here that's come in from the chat, which I think is quite relevant. First, saying all of you are making really important points, and this person is saying they feel that it's such a shame that these things are pitted against each other, as we've been talking about, and things are often framed as climate campaigners versus coal workers. Elif, I think you probably have some direct experience with this. And this person is asking, I wonder how might environmental campaigners further support a just transition approach that allows more inclusion and for these groups to better work together. So Elif, maybe you have some examples from your experience.
Yes, thank you. So for us, Can Europe is a network of NGOs. We have more than around 130 members in all around Europe. So I wanted to say this because as councils and commissions were mentioned, I think NGO networks are also useful in that sense for bringing different stakeholders for communication. What we have been doing, for instance, I mean, of course, our members in certain countries, for instance, for coal, Central Eastern European countries, the debate is going on at the moment. And coal commission, the example of Germany, is now being repeated in Czech Republic and in Poland as well. There are similar discussions. So beyond that, what our members found useful and how we approach to this, like making more links with different stakeholder holders, is bringing NGOs at national and local level together with trade union confederations. This is what we have been doing for the last, well, since the Paris Agreement, but more and more the last 2 years, together with International Trade Union Confederation and the European Trade Union Confederation. That dialogue, we got positive feedback from both sides, saying that dialogue really fulfills a gap of information flow. Of course, at national and local level, it is different. So I think one has to understand that environmental campaigners that work at local level, for instance, in Silesia, the Polish coal lignite region, they work differently than national or European environmental campaigners. They have to sit together with different stakeholders and work together, because, as we all mentioned, otherwise real solutions are not possible. And so how it does, I think, what is the most important ingredient in this is to have the local basis. I mean, having, of course, arguing around emission reductions and numbers and a date for coal phase out. So I agreed with Peter that 2038 is a really late date for Germany to phase out coal. But so these can come out. But of course, dialogue at local level is really important to push to the limits of what is actually feasible without destroying livelihoods, and even making them better, and for giving options to people at local level as well. So it's not only environmental campaigners, but other experts, social workers and social experts as well, and to come to go to the ground and come up with options for people and for youth and for different segments of the society to show the potential of the way out of the existing system.
Thanks. That's a really, really good point about the differences between national and local campaigners and the need for maybe social worker involvement and everything. Thanks for that. Peter, I have a very specific personal question that's come in for you. Someone saying the EEAC seems to have a really important role to play in all this, and you've just been elected as their new president of the NAT section. So what are your ambitions in the context of the just transition debate in your new role?
My ambition is not. It doesn't start now. It starts 5 years ago when we start thinking more strategic and more solution orientated. At first in the food sector, so we created an idea of a comprehensive food policy together with my colleague Monica Gornini from the ESC. We developed an idea on a farm to fork strategy, and we didn't expect that the Commission will come out with an idea like that. So this was already 5 years ago. Then we started a debate in the ESC, also strategically, on the leaving no one behind and the well-being economy. So, and once you have to start with the bigger pictures, to explain to people, to bring ideas that there is the possibility of alternatives. It is not that everything is in stone. It is written in stone, so we can't change the world, because the neoliberals, they changed it as well. They started 30 years ago, 35 years ago or longer, so they changed it into a really nasty economy, which leaves almost everybody behind. So that means, for me, what is my perspective now in the next 2.5 years? To strengthen this idea, to bring to all the stakeholders in this discussion process exactly this idea, bring to your attention that we adopted an opinion on a well-being economy. My expert was Tim Jackson. Some of you might know him. So, and we produced an idea to say, go out of the addiction of growth and think in well-being terms. I mean, we have to cope with the reality. No? The reality is, as we saw, the common agriculture policy was now reshaped, and to be honest, I'm not happy at all with this. And but that's why it is so important, again, having this kind of civil dialogue together with all the stakeholders. So, but my ambition is clear: make the Green Deal to a green and social deal. Otherwise, there will be no success. That's for me clear.
Thanks, Peter. Well, we all look forward to you achieving this ambition, hopefully with our help too. We've run out of time for this session, but I want to thank you all, Elif, Peter, Arnaud and Luc, for your excellent contributions and for this discussion that was really interesting, and to all of you who included great questions for the panelists. So please now wait for the next session, the next part of the morning, but thank you all for your time. Before we move on to our last session of the day, I'd like to introduce our second winning piece from the 2020 Irish Writers Centre Writing for Change Flash Fiction. Tegan Ford will now be reading her winning entry in the Irish language entitled Cuineanna na Foin Lodge, which has something to do with swallows, I'm told, by Irish speakers. And special thanks again to Tegan and Laura, the Irish Writers Centre and the Botanic Gardens for this.
La níam miscíháin ag braca an lei, mo gruch bioga ag canna gantrí na chuí éigean. Is barog teocríoch é cé dealamh na gréine, ag ainan mo chlúh il dach go lasánta. Lon riam go misnú in aig miniad lom. Nó spáil báistí ag péintáil an spéir lia in íag an sturm. Tá chéad cosúlachtaí an uair faoi lán seol thar timpeall orm. Gannairí de bhóthar leat ag dhéagam don duilleog bhuí atá ag fiodhringe síos ach síos os mo chóir amach. Ré chun suan an gheimhrí go fáilte bhí deara. Fágam sláán salúnta le mo cheann cara, an daran neartfar sin a thug foscadum ó níor den gach stern a rugair in an lína. Crocam mo seolta agus búlam an bóthar meastar ó dheas. Tá an dúcha ag nochta ó scóir mo húil. Tá sí lusca le gaí agus le gaon. Mo gádaíon faris bocht. Búlann an bula dóite mé go train, agus líanann mo húla le deora. Tágam chun talamh na críomhrúte. Feicim mo chairde go léir, mo chairde álann, blóte, scata timpeall an nua is an seo, gan búla ar bith in na scíochán spadánta. Tá an flóra dóite spalta leis an tart. Tá brón uirm a cealla cabachta. Níl rud ar bith agam díobh ach na deora atá á síle le na rua. Is suúrach an airgéis iad ach gealan go manaigh siad presúla tréachta le chulla sáil siar. Slán na chairde, go bhfeicigh mé a ríist sibh in néan na spéir sa taucús. Fágam má bhaile léirscrista lán na bhrón ábhéalta. Tá madan an dóchas mééis an air. An dóchas scoil an daran neartfar ag fannachtar min éireann. Tlí mar dólamh gan atribh ar bit ón bíon. Mo híam an cio ar mo brún. Tá mé beag nach bhean. Déanam sochama trína scána ratha ar thóir mo nead sábháilte. Ach níl sí ann, nó an dar. Tá inalbhí mór an miltanacha ag gabháil timpeall in áráit. Géileann na miscíochán lag. Titim síos agus síos. Tá an sulas a géileáin, tá sé gairí dúirce inis. Chluis an bígéal braim a chaide ag Canadam. Feicigh mé sibh go libh. Dúna mo thuúile agus cuireann an seohín seo suamhnach. Mé ar bhóthar meastar deireanach, hús go híomnas na blahas. Suamhna sirí dá alam a déir na lína sin na bhairg mé, an anóg deireanach a chanach pert na madana go bog bing ag fáinnig gealan lei.
We hope you enjoyed that. Now for a highlight of the conference, we will be honoured shortly by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. But first, I'd like to ask Dr. Larry O'Connell, the Director of NESC, to introduce this session and help us think about what the next steps are for the Just Transition mission, process and practice in the context of COVID-19.
Thanks so much, Cara. It really is hard to believe that we're just about to enter the final session of the conference. In my introductory remarks this morning, I drew attention to three things: ambition, co-production and institutional learning, that I think are key to how we move forward with the Just Transition. So I want to just tease through a few of those just very briefly, and I will mention some of the speakers from yesterday, although I do apologise because I wasn't at all of the spotlight sessions. The first thing to come true for me was ambition, that it is absolutely clear that there's an ambition for a radical change, just transition and new approaches, but also that it's not actually occurring in isolation from other pressures such as digitalization and industrial transformation. So again, this morning is coming through very clearly that how we frame this challenge is critical. We heard on Tuesday from Stefano Grassi, who made it clear that we need to focus on the opportunities and the benefits, and that was echoed again this morning. I think also on Tuesday, Sharon Burrows made a very passionate plea that we consider both net zero emissions, but also net zero jobs as being a key goal. And I think that again was echoed by Peter Schmidt's reference to the idea to really frame this broadly as being the well-being economy is what we're focused on. Our own work in NESC has recently focused on trying to ensure that the approach to recovery here is grounded in sustainable development. And I think this broad, high-level framing really does help to align policy so that more of the financing instruments will be available to support the project of transformation. However, the broad framing was also manifested in other ways during the conference, and really what it manifested in urging us to try to connect with people's circumstances and lived experiences. We heard on Tuesday from Minister Ryan, who talked about the retrofit project as a transformation societal project that would help to address long-standing issues in relation to inequality and fuel poverty. We heard from Charlotte Hartley talk about the work on the Scottish Just Transition Commission, which is working in a very sensitive way to work with people's lived injustices in areas like housing, education and jobs. So I think that wider framing is really critical to how we move forward. The second thing that really came through, I think, is this idea of co-production. Robert Pollock on Tuesday focused on the need to engage and support citizens and businesses and all members of the community to develop solutions. Ireland's Just Transition Commissioner Kieran Mulvey highlighted this importance in his work of understanding the needs of the community. And we heard very interesting approach from Brendan O'Loughlin in the local development company, which has developed a really practical 4-step tool that can actually identify those needs and help to work people to work with others in their community. So the thing though that came across to me is that we really do need to understand what co-production actually means. It is about drawing people in at the design phase, and that was really vividly clear in the Offaly example. But it was also clear in the example that Luke gave us this morning that that's what the consultation process is about. It's about bringing people in at the design stage, not at the implementation stage. And we heard yesterday from Seamus Boland in Irish Rural Link, who told us that that's a skill and a capacity that we have to develop. We need to work at doing that, and that will be critical to advancing the just transition. In terms of co-production, I think it's really clear that social dialogue is seen by many of our speakers as being critical. And if you follow that logic of co-production, then the social dialogue must focus on real live issues that matter to people. And again, I think Peter made that very, very clear in the last session, that we need to focus social dialogue on really figuring out what are the jobs and opportunities that will support families and allow them to live in their area. So we heard some great examples then of co-production, but I think we really do need to go further to figure out what co-production actually really means, what it means for the plans that we then write, and what it means for higher up actors and institutions. And in that sense, I think the third issue I'd want to focus on is this one of institutional learning. I was really struck by Karen Power's Sonic Pollinators piece yesterday, which looked at how we engage in active listening to the world and to each single musician's role in the whole. And the conference really has brought about for me this need to look at how our institutions learn and, as Karen said, actively listen to the experiences of individuals. So in terms of just closing, the institutional learning piece for me focuses on 3 things. I think we all know about this idea that institutions need to close the knowledge gap. We heard lots of our speakers talk about the need for us to understand more about, for example, water quality. Nihat Zal talked about this idea that we don't really know enough at fine-grained spatial scales about key issues about water quality. So we need to close that knowledge gap, and that gets more precision towards our advice and regulation. But I think institutions also need to think about an experience gap. I think the conference really highlighted the importance of rich and open dialogue between different institutions. The experiences of working on solutions, and for example, the statement by Brendan from Offaly that there are myriads of funding streams, but they're hard to access. Well, that needs to be listened to. That clearly indicates a constraint higher up the policy system. It needs to be, those concerns need to be heard and actively considered by people working higher up in institutions. So it's clear that we need better feedback loops and means of dialoguing between institutions and decision makers, and that will be key to moving just transition forward. Again, Arno noted this morning, the key is to find ways to talk to people, to talk with people rather than to people. So the third and final issue in terms of institutional learning for me is I think there's a visibility gap. I mean, the reality of the transition is that the precise challenges are not always that visible. Again, Ela noted that particularly this morning, is that we really need to work hard to identify who's the most impacted in a specific area or sector. And it's also worth noting that people at a local level are often very focused on the day-to-day, so they themselves find it difficult to actually work out the justices or the injustices of a particular transition. So the challenge for institutions is also to try to close this visibility gap. And we interestingly heard quite a bit about that through the conference. One of the presentations, Tamara Metz's presentation of work in the Netherlands, was really fascinating. She focused on the actions that could be taken by a national institution to make the actual transition and the justices and injustice more visible. That there are a number of steps. Develop maps to make the energy and justice actually visible. Collaboratively help improve people's understanding of the injustice through face-to-face dialogue. And then one of the final one, which I thought was really interesting, is make the energy conflicts productive. Don't dismiss them, figure out ways that we actually learn from them. Again, Luke's account of the environmental justice work in the UK provided another example of focusing the policy system on trying to identify those particular gaps and injustices in the transition. So in closing, I think that the issues of framing and funding ambition, the co-production question, and institutional learning and active listening are key to moving forward. However, the good thing is we're not quite finished yet, and there are others coming in the next session who I think I'm sure will add more to our font of knowledge about how we move forward. But to open this session, I'm really delighted to welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. We know in NESC that just transition is a hugely important issue to him, and he's written recently about it and kindly referenced our work. So, Uachtaráin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for those kind words and for being with us today. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts now.
Accordia, I'm so pleased to be here with you today at the annual conference of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils, which Ireland's National Economic and Social Council is hosting this year. The theme of your conference this year could not be more relevant nor more urgently needed, focusing as it does on the critical issue of how a just transition for all may be delivered through the development of appropriate principles, policies and practice. So may I commence by thanking Dr. Larry O'Connell, Director of NESC, and Mr. Arno Querebasa, Chairman of the EEAC network, for the kind invitation to join with you here today and the opportunity to address you. It is difficult to overstate the importance of this conference, given that it is taking place as we continue to deal with a pandemic that is having such devastating personal, social and economic consequences. Your conference represents the taking of a unique opportunity to engage in terms of adequacy and courage with the theory, empirical research, policy and practice relating to one of the most critical challenges in contemporary public policy. How are we to ensure, within principles of inclusivity, that we move towards a net zero economy and society across Europe, towards such a transformation as will result in regenerated soils, protected biodiversity and oceans, and a thriving circular economy, adjustments all of which are so urgently necessary if we are to avoid ecological catastrophe. Just transition is a framework which was developed by the trade union movement to encompass that range of social interventions which are needed to secure workers' rights and livelihoods when economies are shifting to sustainable production, while having at the same time as a primary aim combating climate change and protecting biodiversity. The term just transition appears to have been first coined by North American trade unions in the 1990s to describe a support system for workers that were facing unemployment owing to necessary environmental protection policies. One early proponent was Tony Mazzocchi, who described it as a super fund for workers, one that would provide financial support and an opportunity for higher education for those displaced by emerging environmental protection policies. The term's further evolution is, of course, well described in an article published in the International Journal on Labour Research in 2010 by Annabel Rosenberg. The concept itself can be considered as an ecological application of an economic conversion that was developed in the 1980s when anti-war activists sought to build a coalition with workers in the armaments industry, thereby giving them a stake in the anti-war movement and peace economy. It brings to my mind the work of the great Irish-born scientist and trade union activist Mike Cooley, best known for his work designing and promoting the theory and practice of human-centered, socially useful production and innovation. Just transition is therefore about profound structural change that has personal and societal ramifications. However, it is a transformation that will be defined by the values brought to it, hence the importance of all partners, trade unions and socially concerned employers, being involved in the dialogue as to how the industry or sector is to be restructured. There is a concern, which is correct in my view, that periods of economic structural change could leave workers, their families and communities to bear the costs of the transition, thus leading to unemployment, poverty and exclusion for those left behind. In contrast to those with more flexible and mobile skill sets who are able to afford and adapt to the transition. This is a very real concern. It is based on evidence of previous structural transformations that have occurred, such as that in the 1980s, with the closure of the coal mines in Britain and the devastating consequences that ensued for the lives and livelihoods of the miners, their families and communities, and the loss of a social cohesion that has not been recovered to this day. Just transition addresses this concern by promoting sustainable actions to help workers in a transition, by ensuring workers' voices are part and parcel of any conversion. Uniting the great and urgent projects of social and climate justice by means of a just transition necessitates, for example, that we comply with demands for fairness for coal miners and peat extraction workers in coal and peat-dependent underdeveloped regions who lack employment opportunities beyond coal and peat. Fairness for farmers who will be required to change practices for the protection of climate and natural systems. Fairness for workers in emerging economies who demand their share of the so-called industrialization dividend. Fairness for those having to abandon their homes as sea levels rise and threaten coastal regions and islands as a consequence of climate change. Fairness for those populations impacted by air pollution and broader environmental impacts of fossil fuel use. The challenge is to produce policy measures which enable workers and sectors to be the arrow of change rather than the battered target of random initiatives. In Ireland, just transition will be particularly pertinent to both the agriculture and peat extraction sectors if our climate targets are to be met over the coming decades. We will all have to make significant changes to our lifestyles, but for some, the changes will be more considerable. Farmers, for example, will be required to change the basis of their livelihoods, and peat extraction workers will, when the extraction ceases, have to be enabled to move into more ecologically sustainable occupations, or, in some cases, compensated in such a fashion as will enable their changed but full participation in community life. This will make for a real challenge in terms of how we think and act. It is the challenge of taking a new road, and it will entail having to eschew any reluctance to question the assumptions, practices and structures of decision makers that may be neither helpful nor inclusive or represent simply lazy thinking. We are fortunate in that there is a significant research available to governments and their institutions that now face the challenge of managing the just transition to an eco-social sustainable future. Many people have written of the significance in Irish economic history of the publication of what was to become known as the Whitaker Report and its connection to Ireland's first programme for economic expansion, 1958 to 1963. Dr. T.K. Whitaker has been rightly honoured for his dedicated and exemplary work as a senior civil servant and insightful economist. While many reports on different aspects of society and economy have made a valuable contribution, few have acquired the seminal status of an influencing document on public policy, such as Dr. Whitaker's document did some 62 years ago. In an opinion piece I wrote for the Irish newspaper, the Sunday Business Post, published in April this year, I stated that I believe there is a contemporary candidate in the report addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland, published by the National Economic and Social Council in March this year, 2020. It would be so regrettable if, owing to the understandable focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts, that this, what I believe to be a seminal document, did not receive the attention it deserves. That loss would be considerable, given that the analysis contained in the report is the product of consensus from all sections of the Irish economy, civil society, and the public service. It is, however, for reasons even beyond that consensus, important as it is, that the document has significance and demands attention. NESC had been requested by government to examine the specific issue of the vulnerability for workers in all forms of employment and sectors impacted by two transitions: the transition to net zero carbon and the deepening of technological and digitalization developments. The ensuing report is a research-validated overview of the challenges facing the economy as it is embedded in society, and the practical choices facing employers, employees, and the enterprise sector. May I suggest that this document, which draws correctly on international evidence and case studies, is an invaluable resource and a credit to those who researched, prepared, and agreed it. The vision outlined by NESC is as follows. Our vision for Ireland is to become a resilient, sustainable, thriving, net zero economy, environment, and society, using innovation and collective preparedness to shape the future we want to achieve. It is a vision for an Ireland where the state plays its part in ensuring mission-oriented actions to achieve a high-quality jobs economy and productively addresses employment vulnerability as part of a just transition. The analysis and framework contained in this NESC report is open to differing and adaptable opportunities for implementation, accepting that there is no one readily available template, recipe, or off-the-shelf approach that is applicable for all circumstances. Some 12 key recommendations for government are offered, and it is proposed that these are taken forward by a Just Transition Review Group in a way that is fair, participative, and place-based, both in process and in outcome. The report describes how innovation and regional development can be taken into account in a just transition framework. This return to regionalism is so welcome and long overdue. Decades ago, the late Dr. Michael Bannon and I attended as Irish observers to the British Regional Studies Association. With the exception of scholars such as Professor P.J. Drudy, meaningful regionalism has regrettably received scant attention in recent years. The third section of the NESC report draws on international case studies, setting out potential exemplars of the just transition policy approach. It would be a tragedy, I repeat, if the pressure of contemporary events resulted in this valuable contribution being overlooked, as the challenges identified by the report will endure beyond the current crisis. The Council has identified recommendations which will help Ireland address these, while also embracing the significant opportunities that will arise. Studying transition in the particular manner that the Council has done is thus relevant to the crisis, its aftermath, and our recovery. Its content is well aligned, a real advantage with the obligations to which we as a nation, along with other nations, have made a commitment through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. My wife Sabine and I are strong advocates of that 2030 agenda in the Sustainable Development Goals, and believe it represents a shining light, a landmark agreement that was the culmination of an unprecedented process of public consultation and intergovernmental negotiations, the final stage of which Ireland had the honour to co-facilitate together with Kenya. The NESC research, European colleagues' research, and your conference discussions over the last days underscore the critical importance of approaching any major transition in an economy, structural or otherwise, as a just transition, committing to the principle of equality, of participation in society and economy, assuring that the vulnerable are protected, that inclusion and participation are front and centre stage. Major transformations require an enormous commitment to research and evidence, and that such evidence, which constitutes a real resource, should be from multiple reliable sources. Research and early assessment of the social and employment impacts of climate policies is critical. A further reason that attracted me to the analysis contained in the NESC report was that it offered a useful intellectual framework for the wider challenge we face as we attempt to forge a new path to an enlightened political economy founded on ecology, social cohesion, and equality. NESC recommends a purposeful, participative, and multifaceted approach to governance, appropriate social protection for those at risk from transition impacts, supportive arrangements and sectoral measures, and inclusive place-based development and investment. I strongly support the Council's call for the establishment of a meaningful social dialogue and deliberative process, which should be framed in the wider context of discussions with regard to how we embed the just economy in society, now so urgently needed, and indeed desired by the citizenry. Social dialogue and real inclusive democratic consultation with all social partners should be a fundamental principle of any just transition approach. Just transition also requires sustainable investments in low-emission and job-intensive sectors and technologies. These investments must be undertaken through a process of due consultation with all those affected, respecting human and labour rights, as well as principles of decent work. Technological developments can be advanced from a humanistic perspective, as the late Irish scientist Mike Cooley, to whom I have referred, advocated so passionately throughout his career, be it at Lucas Aerospace or at the Greater London Council. Human-centred, socially useful production can become a lead focus of research and technology if we choose it to be. Together with appropriate investment and labour market policies, we will require strong social protection policies to safeguard and protect the most vulnerable. Local economic diversification, plans that support decent work and provide community stability during the transition are all part of the suite of actions that will be required. Just transition will necessitate resolute action by all of government, setting out priority actions, the sequence of interventions and timeframes for implementation, as well as consideration of what resources are needed to meet this challenge of economic and societal transformation. Critically, a cognitive transformation is required so that public spending, particularly that aimed at filling infrastructural gaps, is viewed as an investment in both society and the economy, not as a cost or a burden, as regrettably it has often been so myopically considered. It would be naive to assume that there will not be those who will place what is familiar but clearly insufficient ahead of the necessary change we are discussing. COVID-19 has resulted in huge suffering and tragedy around the globe, but it has occasioned a near widespread agreement on the necessity of public spending and of a fundamentally new, socially, economically, and ecologically sustainable future. For us in Ireland, the NESC report is surely an invaluable departure point for deliberative dialogue on how we can best do this with the most favourable outcome for all. It offers a solid framework for ongoing discussion, but also the necessary action that can garner public support from all concerned. We have available to us in NESC 149 a methodology and a process that can speed our efforts, combining the fruits of consensus and meticulous research as a basis for policy advice. The challenges identified by the report endure beyond the current crisis, and I repeat my sincere hope that this valuable work, with its commitment to the principles of equality, participation, and protection of the marginalised, is made central to our future thinking. Successful crisis management is, as we have come to learn, no guarantee of durable reform. We therefore must embed the hard-earned wisdom from the COVID-19 crisis into strong scholarly work, policy, and institutional frameworks. This is the great challenge from a political economy perspective. What we teach as economics must be pluralistic, rich in intellectual engagement, methodologically adequate if it is to be the source of good inclusive policy. At European Union level, the European Commission's Green Deal, the plan that aims to have the EU climate neutral by 2050, contains a just transition mechanism in which there is a budget set aside for retraining workers impacted by job losses. Coming from the EU budget and private sector investment, it promises to mobilise at least 150 billion by 2027, focusing on the regions, industries and workers who will face the greatest challenges. Additional funding for training and reskilling is also available in the European Social Fund and the European Globalisation Adjustment Fund, all of which is welcome. The Just Transition Fund defines cohesion policy as the appropriate framework for it to address structural changes in Europe's regions. However, the current political and economic context, dominated by the COVID-19 crisis, will undoubtedly have a negative financial impact on the European economy's outlook. In the aftermath of the pandemic, European regions and their economies will be under stress, and their focus should be on empowering workers and regional communities through cohesion policy, rather than using these funds for other purposes. In this context, the additional €10 billion to be added to the multi-annual financial framework under the EU Recovery Fund, Next Generation EU, for the Just Transition Programme is a worthy first step. But will it be enough to cope with the economic impact of COVID-19 on Europe as well? Europe must step up to the challenge of just transition across the regions through adequate resourcing if it is to retain legitimacy across the citizenries of Europe. Now is the time to be bold. After all, the challenge now is to make new forms of European and global economy. We have seen, it has been empirically demonstrated, how the poor have suffered and continue to suffer disproportionately during the COVID-19 crisis, with the distributive effects more favourable to the already privileged and well-off. We now need a just recovery. We must not allow this regressive trend, which has manifested in such tragic personal and social consequences, to continue as we embark on the difficult journey to transform our societies and economies towards ecological sustainability. Just transition allows us the opportunity to break the cycle of disadvantage by ensuring that those most vulnerable to economic turbulence are protected. The deal that must follow the short-term rescue measures and guide the path out of the COVID-19 crisis, and thereafter, is the Green Deal injected with and emboldened by more courage. As Maya Gopal wrote in Social Europe recently, people-centred and future-focused crisis management means investing in good education and skills development for all, including an update of what and how we teach and learn. There is no doubt that skills are the currency of the 21st century. Training and skills development will remain key to support the deployment of new technologies and foster industrial change. An upgraded social Green Deal with education, training and skills development at its core. And improved cooperation between member states is an expression of the call for solidarity which the crisis has required. After the narrowly national reactions in too many instances to the onslaught of COVID-19, it is important now to shape a European-wide identity, cognizant of the interwoven tapestry of global connection on which our societies and economies depend, and through which our choices affect lives outside Europe. May I conclude by thanking you for your conference and the invitation to take part in it. I've no doubt that, as was the case in your days so far, the presentations today will be most stimulating, and that your deliberations will be fruitful, yielding powerful insights that may be employed across all sectors: government, enterprise, agriculture, communities and citizens, as we all seek to make this vital transition one which will carry our best efforts of heart and head as we work together for a sustainable, just, shared future on our vulnerable planet Earth. Garamila Mahaki is Barbanat. Many thanks.
Thank you, President Higgins, for that inspirational address. You've given us some incredible food for thought on all the challenges and opportunities ahead, and I would imagine that the team at the National Economic and Social Council will be just thrilled with that overwhelming endorsement of their work on just transition. Thank you. We're now joined by an expert panel to address some of the issues that President Higgins brought up in his address. We have Dr. Patrick Bresnahan from Maynooth University here in Ireland, Alice Charles of the World Economic Forum, but also an Irish woman that we know well, Professor Raphael Heffron from the University of Dundee, Edward Morena from the University of London, and of course, last but never least, Sandrine Dixon-Declève of the Club of Rome. Welcome, panelists, to our final session. It's great to see you all. I'd like to actually pick up on what President Higgins was saying about the challenge of the COVID-19 crisis and how we shape progress toward a just transition with that crisis and with governments and business and civil society building a recovery while also respecting the needs for a just transition at the same time. So, Patrick, if you could kick off this discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Cara. And thanks to NESC and the EEAC for inviting me to be on this this panel with such a great set of speakers. Always hard to follow President Higgins. It was a really comprehensive, inspiring speech, as you said. I think in response to this question about the relationship between COVID-19 and how we move forward with the just transition, there's three things that I think I would touch on. The first is, I think the COVID-19 crisis has really shown us how interconnected our global economic systems are, and how connected the global economic system is with our global environment. So we know that COVID-19, like other viruses of recent times, like SARS or swine flu, is closely connected to processes of rapid land use change and to industrial food production. And these types of economic activities are not localized. They're not even national. They're part of global agri-food systems. And we see with COVID-19 the kind of ramifications of that, and just how vulnerable our economic systems are to that. And I think that what that suggests to me, or what that says to me, is that when we think about just transition and what we want to transition away from and how we want to do that in a just way, we can't just focus on specific sectors of the economy, namely sort of fossil fuel, energy production, extraction. I think that it's understandable that that's where the focus has been and needs to be, because those workers and communities carry a big sacrifice. But I think that we need to look beyond that, those limited sectors, and just see how interconnected things are. The second point is around inequality, and so COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19 has really surfaced, just how unequal society is. And so we know that COVID-19 touches everybody, or can touch everybody, but it doesn't touch everybody equally. And President Higgins, talked about that in his speech. And I think that the important thing there is that these, the unequal distribution of that burden, and we could think about climate change as well, is not random or is not even recent, but is often the product of long-standing structural inequalities. And in order to address them, there needs to be, long-term sort of investments and considerations of those inequalities. And that requires an equity-based approach, and this is a term equity that I think is really important to have in the conversation, because, often solutions or proposals maybe assume that, people are the same, but in actual fact they aren't. And always foregrounding that and making that explicit, including within just transition processes, I think is really important. And then the third point is around the politics of COVID-19. And so COVID-19, or the response to COVID-19, has been, top-down, understandably, unprecedented state interventions. Maybe the only recent comparison is the global financial crash in response to that. But that response has, for the most part, been accepted by the public, and there has been buy-in. There has been a sort of a trust there. There's a faith in public institutions and expertise for the most part. But there has been this nasty, surfacing of a kind of a rejection of that, nominally, to defend certain individual freedoms, but it's been channeled towards some nasty sort of right-wing politics, which we have seen surfacing elsewhere, in recent times, which I don't need to go into. And I think that what that signals to us is that the just transition and climate action more generally, it cannot be top-down. It cannot be seen as a burden imposed on those most vulnerable. It needs to be bottom-up, and it should be popular. It should be something that improves the lives of working people and the lives of the wider community, particularly the most vulnerable. Otherwise, it could lead to some very, nasty outcomes. Not just that it's ineffective, but that it actually leads to some nasty kind of political formations. So those are the three things that I'd like to bring to the discussion.
Thanks, Patrick. Three good points to kick us off. Alice, could I get you to pick up on some of what Patrick was saying and address the same question? Oh, your audio is not on, Alice.
My sincere apologies.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and also just to flag how hard it is to follow our great president. And as a member of the Irish diaspora, I'm always very proud to hear him speak with such passion around issues around climate change, and in this case, the just transition. As I look after cities at the World Economic Forum, maybe I will first of all just flag some of the emerging trends that we've seen in cities as a result of COVID-19. And, what cities are starting to think about in terms of driving a green and just recovery, and some thoughts that Irish cities and wider European cities might want to consider in that regard. So I guess, first of all, we've seen positives and negatives. And one of the big positives has been that we've seen a massive move towards sustainable mobility. And we've seen, particularly in relation to walking and cycling, we've seen footpaths widened, we've seen cycle lanes introduced, and that's all been really positive. But on the other hand, we've seen this move away from public transit. People don't feel safe using public transit. So we need to try and get people back in transit. And we know that many cities, in terms of making them inclusive, by virtue of having people access public transit, it gives them opportunities to vital jobs. So we need to find a way of getting people back on transit and extending that transit. I guess another thing we've seen is this move towards virtual delivery of services. And in a city-related context, of course, if you have access to technology, that is something that you can avail of. But if you don't have that access, then that creates a problem in terms of equity. So I think there's an issue around how can we create access to virtual services and make sure that people from all sections of society can access those services. The other thing I wanted to flag is huge issues in terms of mental health challenges. And just this morning, I was in touch with the city of Melbourne, and they were flagging to me that they have seen a 59% increase in violence against women since COVID-19 started. And I think yesterday the Gardaí came out with figures from Ireland as well. So I think we've seen a very similar picture in Ireland. So I guess what cities are trying to think about is how can they support virtual connections and give access to services and make sure that women don't feel they're alone and can get access to help and aid throughout this challenge. The other thing that we have seen positively is huge innovation flourishing. We've seen open hackathons, with trying to find solutions to the novel challenges that have arisen as a result of COVID. And of course, that's positive. But broadly speaking, what cities are trying to focus on is how can we ensure existing businesses survive, and that's particularly the case around retail, around hospitality, for example, and indeed in some situations, offices. And we know that many of those workers are losing their jobs, and some cities are estimating that up to 15% of their workers will have lost their jobs by 2020. So ensuring business survival is going to be critical in terms of making sure that people have access to employment. But also, how can we encourage new types of businesses to emerge, particularly those that are leveraging digital? And how can we support the transition of land use and transportation within our cities to drive a green and just recovery? But also, how can we ensure that we have the enabling digital infrastructure in our cities and the democratic processes to be able to drive that? But how can we also create cohesion? So I guess what I'm seeing in cities around the world is a huge drive towards social equity, seeking to ensure more equitable and just societies, a drive towards responding to climate, a drive towards resilience, and a drive towards prosperity for all. And in that context, we are seeing that cities are starting to think about how can they deliver the necessary climate and resilience infrastructure. And I guess there's immediate low-hanging fruit in that regard. We know that driving the efficiency agenda in buildings will not only create a lot of jobs where people have lost jobs, they can be reskilled and they can work in this sector, but also it will ensure that we have buildings that are moving towards net zero carbon, but are also well buildings, which is hugely important in this context. But we also have an opportunity to marry that with decarbonising our electricity grid infrastructure, really embracing renewables. And that has been great to see already in Ireland. But we do need people back on mass transit, and we need to continue to invest in mass transit over the next number of years, and also invest in upgrading our water infrastructure and ensuring the rollout of the circular economy. But equally, we know that COVID-19 has shown huge inequality in relation to healthcare. If we look in a European context, for example, Germany has 29 ICU beds per 100,000 of population, but we know in Ireland that it's just over 5. So we obviously need to ensure that there's equity to vital healthcare resources in the future. We also know that right across Europe and indeed across the world, we already had an affordable housing challenge. And that challenge is going to become greater as people lose their jobs. So there's an opportunity for government to invest in building vital social and affordable housing, as well as provide vital community facilities. But I guess what are cities doing to try and respond to a green and just recovery? The solution that's most talked about at the moment is the Paris 15-minute neighbourhood. And that's very much that within 15 minutes of your home, you'll be able to avail of the services that you require to live, work and play. But that's certainly not a new concept. The city of Melbourne, which is constantly regarded as one of the most livable cities in the world, has been doing that for many years. And what that means is that we have access to green spaces, community gardens, local play facilities, lifelong learning, shopping facilities, local employment, local transit, that we can walk and cycle within our neighbourhoods. And we have diverse types of housing that is affordable and accessible to people of all ages and abilities within 15 minutes of our home. I personally am involved in the City of Belfast Growth and Innovation Commission. And what we have been doing there is thinking about how we can deliver a sustainable and inclusive recovery. And that, of course, is a jobs-led recovery, but it focuses on approaches to energy efficiency at the community level. And again, I think that's something that we would very much encourage for cities around the world. But I have to highlight, this is all set against a backdrop of critical issues in terms of public finances. I guess the worst, best case example of that is the City of New York, which is currently looking at a budget deficit in excess of 8 billion. But even cities which traditionally brought in a surplus, for example, Helsinki, which would have brought in a surplus year on year of around 300 million euro, is now looking at a 500 million deficit. So we are seeing deficits because of cuts and decreases in revenue, particularly around public transit, around toll charges, parking charges, property taxes or rates, and etc. And sales taxes is another part of that. But at the same time, we've seen increases in expenses related to health, sanitation, etc. So what we need from national government and indeed from European institutions is funding for our cities to drive a recovery. But also cities need to step up and be prepared to leverage European Investment Bank funding to be able to drive the transition. So I'm going to leave it there, but I'm optimistic that there is a future in relation to cities, and that future can be green and just.
Thank you, Alice. You gave us some shocking statistics there, but also lots of hopeful opportunities too. Sandrine, can I come to you on the same question and hear your perspective, please?
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure to hear, first of all, from the President and so many also from the previous panel, using language that the Club of Rome has been using for the last 50 years. You know you're getting a little bit closer to mainstreaming when this language is being adopted around moving beyond GDP, prosperity without growth, and that becomes more commonplace. Clearly, the just transition was originally established as a way to create a dialogue by the unions. And I so agree with so many of the other speakers that we need to shift from that. And what we need to do now, post-COVID, is tap into the consciousness of people that actually we are at a transformational moment, that they are already part of the transition. But we need to figure out how we can bring people on the journey. So if the question to all of us is, how do we design that journey? How do we put in place the real shift in the system in order to enable us to really transition in a way which is just, not just to people, by the way, but also to the planetary boundaries, because we are all absolutely dependent on the well-being of our planet and our ecosystems. One way to do that clearly has already been mentioned by many, which is to look at a well-being economy, to look at the way in which we develop a society which brings in environmental, social, and economic indicators. And we now have well-being governments. Scotland, New Zealand, Wales, Costa Rica is starting, Iceland, all moving forward in this way, and so many local initiatives that are also implementing donut economics, which was developed by Kate Rayworth, also a member of the Club of Rome. So what's really important now is to find a way to unpack the tensions, because we haven't yet spoken about the tensions. We've spoken about all the incredible opportunities. We've seen that cities are already totally shifting before our eyes in response to COVID. How do we look at housing? How do we shift, actually, unfortunately now, the fact that we do not have working spaces which are being used as much into much more housing spaces so that cities can actually be more equitable and bring people back into the cities? How do we look at transport so that we don't continue for the moment to bail out big transport companies where actually the funds are predominantly going to save the company and not necessarily the jobs of people? Nor is it actually respecting the way in which we want to move forward towards decarbonization and reduce, for example, aviation and the stress points and emissions on the environment and on climate. So my call, and a call that has been made by many of us, including the work that we're now doing on research and innovation inside the European Commission and looking at the economic and societal impacts, is that we need to understand how we protect people, planet, and prosperity. What does that mean in practice? What type of taxation structures and market mechanisms do we need to enable that to happen? Then how do we prepare better for the next crises? Donella Meadows, who actually was one of the key authors in the Limits to Growth, indicated that we would never see just one singular crisis. This would be a series of crises. We are in the midst of a convergence of tipping points between climate, ecosystems loss, and now COVID, which we know is a zoonotic disease and caused by the first two. So how do we prepare for that resilience? What type of infrastructure do we need to put in place? Not only that is more adaptive and flexible, but also how do we tap into the creativity of people and the way in which we govern to enable us to be prepared for future crises, to put in place the plans that are necessary, but also embed the flexibility, the rapid response and risk analysis that we need. And then lastly, what does then the transformation of society look like? How do we put new prosperity principles at the core? Not looking at growth as the ultimate, but actually looking at a much more equitable pattern of distribution of wealth, as well as clearly understanding the impact that we have each as individuals with regard to consumption, the way in which we look at materials, the fact that we need to be much more circular and regenerative in the way in which we engage with the economy. So the positive note of all of this is that although we are going through a desperate situation where people's lives and livelihoods have absolutely been impacted, we have also seen that many have been able to step up to the plate. At this time when we need transformation, we have governments who have shown leadership, and of course many who have not. But we also have, both at the local level, in communities that have come together, that have demonstrated solidarity and have demonstrated how they can design within this chaos new ways to actually do business, new ways to communicate that actually have less impact. We can only hope that coming out of COVID, we will all have come out with a much greater consciousness about what is most essential to us: access to food, access to water, access to healthcare, access to jobs and livelihoods. That the rest, the dependency on materials, is no longer, and should never have been, our driven force for being on this planet or living our lives. And so I am hopeful, if we look at the leadership that we've just heard from the President of Ireland, but also the leadership that we are now seeing in many European member states and at the European level. If you even look at the fact that we have a conservative president of the European Commission who is talking about the need to shift from wealth to well-being, who is putting in place a social and also Green New Deal, and who is trying to look at the vision of the future and ways in which we can work together, which we have been directly supporting her in a new compass around the European Green Deal to make that a reality. Firmly believe at the Club of Rome that this is the opportunity, that our lives are in our hands and in the hands of real leadership, and that we need a re-articulation of human development for the 21st century, going beyond just what we've been calling a just transition, to redirect purpose from growing GDP to securing the well-being of people and planet. And this is the time to really focus on what it means to look at well-being for each of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. You joined the dots on a lot of issues there, and I think just mentioning the book, The Limits to Growth, you've really proved its timelessness even in times of COVID-19. Thank you for that. Raphael, as a leading researcher on the just transition, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you. So I suppose in echoing a couple of the discussions that have already happened this morning, I think there's a key issue around capacity building on the just transition. I think education is required, and let's say education and training about what the just transition is and how to achieve it is needed for all parts of society. So for the governments, for the private sector, and for the public sector. And in terms of this, I think we need to ensure that there is a consistency in the message. You know, what is the just transition? And for me, I think, and I will say a bit more about it, I think there has been a bit too much emphasis on, you know, getting the energy workers out of, you know, working in their sectors and into, let's say, newer sectors. I think as Sandrine and a couple of the other speakers this morning, you know, the just transition is far broader than that, and it is about developing a low carbon economy which is just and reflects on, you know, some of the principles mentioned by our president this morning. But, you know, distributive justice, procedural, recognition, restorative, cosmopolitan justice, all these forms of justice are at the heart of the just transition and what they bring. A second point that I would like to make is, you know, in terms of COVID-19, we live in, you know, a society that is experiencing a financial recession. This will go on. And, you know, what I would say is we need to look for ways of reigniting the economy. And, you know, for me, when we live in a financial crisis, we automatically are going to be more risk conservative. So what we need to find out is how can we de-risk investments that can make a low carbon economy. And if I'm looking around at the world today, I see a lot of subsidies for jobs in all types of sectors. Well, perhaps we should be ensuring that some of these subsidies for jobs are redirected and targeted at companies and different sectors that can ensure a low carbon economy. And that brings me to my final point where, and I echo our president's call, you know, we need to be more bold. I don't think, you know, I disagree maybe with one of the other speakers this morning. I don't think the just transition to a low carbon economy is just about a bottom up process. This is about top down as much as bottom up. You know, we need action finally from our political leaders. There needs to be a redesign of the way we are thinking, and maybe in that reflection, it's good that Sandrine mentioned, you know, what is happening at the EU level. But we do need to be bold, and we do need to think about, you know, the reality of some of the early decision making on the just transition. You know, I would point to the example in Germany around coal. You know, if we are going to subsidize coal in Germany until 2038, how long are we going to subsidize gas and oil for after that? You know, is this a way of distracting from the low carbon economy plans when, you know, we continue to overly rely on Russian gas? To me, we need to be far, far bolder. And I think, you know, we need to say, just as the fossil fuel industry have said and continue to say around Europe, that renewable energy should survive in the marketplace according to market conditions. Well, I would think that we need to do a full assessment of the subsidies going to fossil fuels. In Ireland, there continues to be subsidies for extracting fossil fuels. Well, it's already not a level playing field for low carbon energy, and then we want to give them further support so that they can transition out of their business. You know, so I think we need a reevaluation of what we are thinking about here. You know, we need to ask ourselves the question: if we are allowing, you know, these industries to meet the consequences of the markets, which they say all low carbon options have to adhere to. And for me, I think, you know, we really need to sit down in this time where we are subsidizing our economies. How best can we ensure that these subsidies target the right industries? And I don't believe, despite some of the EU actions, the EU and many countries have a policy of technology neutral auctions in terms of the energy sector. I think if we're actually serious about the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, we're serious about our climate ambitions, we have to move beyond these technology neutral debates, and we have to start saying we want to give the subsidy support that is currently being given to fossil fuels. We have to give that at least, if not more, to low carbon options across all society, whether it be transport, energy, agriculture, etc. The list goes on. So I think for me, if we sit down and we rethink the way we are going to finance our economy, I think the COVID-19 can act as an accelerator for the just transition. And we do have to remember, in the context of the just transition to a low carbon economy, we have had major calls from the leading scientific journals such as Nature since 2017 saying that we need this transition to happen as fast as possible. So in the darkness, perhaps COVID-19 can be the light and accelerate the just transition to a low carbon economy. So thank you.
Thanks, Raphael. That's a really good end point. And I also think a good point on the need for top-down intervention, particularly on the subsidy issue. Edouard, you have a global perspective in your work and you consider the future a lot. So what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I'd like to also thank and congratulate speakers in this session and throughout the conference. I mean, I find it really, really stimulating. I guess, I mean, a lot of it has already been said, and so I'll try not to repeat too much of what has already been said by my colleagues in this session. But I think, for a start, maybe we need to kind of also replace the just transition concept and remember that, you know, the just transition concept was already gaining more and more attention before the COVID crisis. And I guess ever since the inclusion of the just transition concept in the Paris Climate Agreement, the just transition has been on the kind of climate policy agenda at least. And other events, for instance, Donald Trump's election in 2016, the fact that he was elected in part through the support of the Rust Belt and communities and workers in some of the kind of remaining coal mining regions. More recently in France, the Yellow Vest movement at the end of 2018. There were already a series of signals on the need to kind of better include the kind of justice dimensions within the kind of low carbon discussions and policy discussions in particular around the low carbon transition. So I would argue that, you know, the COVID-19 crisis, and I think, you know, again, this is what other speakers have said, has really contributed to a kind of an acceleration of history. It has highlighted existing inequalities, but it has also, and it is also contributing to exacerbate them. And I guess the other point I'd like to make is how it has also, I mean, and this is what I find interesting and revealing with the COVID-19 crisis, the experience of lockdown in particular, is that it has also brought a number of pre-existing and pressing issues to the fore. You know, systemic racism, growing income and spatial inequalities, the democratic deficit, and growing distrust between the people and the elites. But also, and I think this is an studied and very important issue, the importance of care and the care economy and care workers and how central they are to our resilience and our capacity to effectively continue to kind of live in this kind of period of crisis. And so I guess going forward, you know, when you look ahead, I think this also highlights the need to adopt a holistic approach to just transition, an approach that does not limit itself to, you know, transitioning from the grey to green jobs, but also focuses on other justice concerns and in particular sheds light on underrepresented constituencies. As I said, you know, people of color, the carers, the marginalized and the vulnerable, who are the hardest hit by the COVID crisis and its economic repercussions, and also the most affected by the climate crisis. Second, and so again, this is, I guess, building on points that have already been made. A second point, which is also in line with what has been said, is, you know, making sure that just transition policies actually empower frontline communities by not only giving them a voice, but also the means to collectively shape their own future. And so I think this requires us, and I feel that this is where, I mean, I was also very, I really appreciated President O'Higgins' speech. And what I particularly found interesting, what he was saying, is how he came back, how he kind of retraced the history and the origins of the just transition concept. And I think this is really fundamental, really highlighting the fact that the just transition concept is quite unique. It's a concept that was born within the labor movement. It was a concept that was born within frontline communities in the US in the 1980s and early 90s. And so, unlike other concepts which we see kind of circulating around kind of policy circles, such as the green economy, green growth, even sustainable development, this is a concept that it is rooted. It is rooted in communities. And I think that that's what makes it so special, and that's what makes it so interesting. And that's also why it has such potential to kind of fill this gap that has constantly existed within the kind of climate policy space and the climate discussion more generally between policymakers and the people and the ordinary people. And so I feel that the just transition has this capacity to build this bridge. But in order for that to happen, we really need to kind of recognize and constantly recognize that this is a concept that it is a concept that has a history, and as I say, that is really rooted in communities. And so as a result, this also means looking at the just transition, not just as a series of policies, but also as a process. And I think that's how it was imagined initially by the labor movement and by frontline communities as well. It was this kind of idea of using this concept to actually build bridges with other communities and to also generate interest within the labor movement in particular in the environmental issue. And so getting workers to engage with the environmental question. And my final point, and this kind of links up to this need for me to expand and to adopt a more holistic approach to just transition, I think that we also need to recognize existing and pre-existing innovative community-based efforts that do and did specifically draw on the just transition framework and concept. And that did also combine these kind of multiple justice approaches. And I think that this, in the United States in particular, which is where the concept was born, you have a number of examples of community-based efforts that are fundamentally rooted in the just transition, that recognize this particular history, that refer to Tony Mazzocchi as President O'Higgins did, but that are also centered on kind of involving communities and combining these multiple justice lenses. So combining racial justice with climate justice and labor justice as well. And so examples include Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi. You also have the Our Power Coalition in California, or Open Buffalo. These are really interesting examples that I feel we could learn a lot from, at least from a European concept, in terms of how to go about involving communities and, as I say, approaching this just transition issue through a holistic lens.
Thanks, Edward. Thanks for that historical context too, which I think is really powerful right now, particularly politically with what's going on around the world. I'm going to bring the first question to Sandrine, and I know, Sandrine, you gave a big picture view of all the issues and joined lots of dots, but this one is quite specific. Looking at 2021, so just in the next year, how can the Just Transition mission be progressed, be it in Ireland, in the EU, or internationally? So a very short time scale there for you to work with.
Well, actually, I think it's a perfect question, because this is supposed to be, in fact, 2020 was supposed to be a super year where we were going to see a link between biodiversity and the climate COP, so the two COPs coming together, so the convergence of those tipping points, with a series of efforts in terms of the Just Transition Fund, EU Invest, etc. So what's really interesting is that we need to make sure now that this super year, which has been pretty much postponed now to 2021, we continue to push the importance of not only the just transition, but a much more holistic systemic approach, whether it be through the European Green Deal at the European level and a green recovery, which, by the way, for the moment is being completely blocked by the European Parliament. The Just Transition Fund, and the way that it was supposed to move forward with some conditionality around what real social and environmental criteria are, is being blocked in the European Parliament. To go back to business as usual interests and some fear, which is exactly what many of the participants have indicated, as well as the president, of people feeling that actually we should only be focusing around social and not environmental. So I think we absolutely have to be clear that there is not one or the other, that our greatest existential risk, us as people, and therefore our lives and livelihoods, depends on getting it right on ecosystems preservation and climate change. So my plea would be that at the international level, we continue to push, and we have been pushing in part of this very instrumental pledge on people and nature. 75 leaders that have already signed that pledge, and I hope it will continue, which really brings into the calls of just transition at an international level, which talks about equity, that at the European level, we continue to push for a green and social recovery that makes sense, that brings in all people, Central and Eastern Europe, also as well as social, the southern countries. And in Ireland, well, I can't really speak directly to Ireland, but I would hope that the president would continue to push and promote what he just said today and not get frightened by the push by business as usual incumbents who are calling to move backwards and not actually move forwards.
Thanks, Sandrine. I would agree with your final comment there. Speaking about Ireland, I think Alice Charles, you'll be able to answer this one from the chat. Referring to your 15-minute city idea, which sounds idyllic, is there a blueprint or a framework for that 15-minute city that could be adopted in Ireland?
I think that obviously in broad terms, it's been outlined by the Mayor of Paris and a particular professor, Carlos Moreno, from Sorbonne University. So they would be the best points of contact. But actually, I think it's worth looking at the Melbourne 20-minute neighbourhood concept, which is actually really detailed. And, I think the thing about Melbourne is, it is regarded as one of the most livable cities in the world, as I highlighted earlier. So they've always focused on addressing climate, but they've always focused on equity. So looking closely at how they defined their 20-minute neighbourhood and how they've went about realising it would be the best source for any city thinking about doing that in Ireland. And happy to follow up with people individually afterwards if necessary.
Yeah, just one follow-on question to that the person was asking, what type of infrastructural investment do you think would be required to sort of develop that concept of a 20-minute city?
So I think that's a really good question, and something that I think cities need to think about in terms of their recovery is both the software and hardware solutions that they will need to implement in order to drive a green and just recovery. And what I mean by software is, relatively inexpensive solutions that actually have large returns on investment. And I think one of the things that Melbourne would always look at is how much tarmac have they actually managed to dig up in their city and transition it to cycle lanes, walkways, public spaces. And, to allow, for example, they were already allowing businesses to expand into the streets like restaurants and so on, which we're seeing, of course, happening in cities around the world. So I think they're very much software interventions, immediate interventions that can be brought to bear that creates accessible parklands, but also creates sustainable transportation and also allows our businesses to survive. For the longer term hardware solutions, you, of course, need huge investment in relation to public transit, our water systems, social and affordable housing. And I think in that context, cities need to, one, rethink their revenues. So what revenues are they reliant upon today that are not coming back? And so how do they need to rethink their revenues to have alternative revenue sources? But the other thing is, they need to think about how can I get access to capital funding to actually deliver that infrastructure in the first place. And one of the things, as an Irish person, obviously I see how Ireland is or isn't performing on the international stage relative to cities. One thing is we don't have empowered city leaders. They don't have budgets to deliver. So it's actually central government that has control. And I think that's something that really needs to change. I feel really positive about Limerick is moving in that direction. And I hope other cities will do likewise. But I think the other thing is that cities in Ireland are not connected to international mayoral networks. So mayors support each other in terms of driving the green just recovery. For example, C40, which is a major mayoral network that's focused on climate, has 95 mayors have been working together throughout the crisis and as they think about recovery, to think about how they collectively can work together to drive a green and just recovery. And the other thing I just wanted to highlight is that Irish cities tend not to leverage the European Investment Bank. So, never was there a time when it was better, when it's actually better to borrow given interest rates, but also recognizing that you have assets that you can borrow again. And for example, social and affordable housing in somewhere like Dublin is the classic. You own all of those assets. If you actually borrow money to invest in those assets, to make those assets more efficient, then of course it has positive outcomes in terms of health, well-being, energy efficiency, and climate poverty, addressing climate poverty. But it actually has huge sort of financial reward to the city authority in terms of it reduces their operational costs. So being brave and leveraging those opportunities to borrow from the likes of the European Investment Bank, I think is critical to driving a recovery in cities.
Thanks. Yeah, we're hopefully seeing a shift in that based on the last budget too. Thanks for that. I'm going to bring the next question to Edouard, but I also think maybe Patrick and Raphael, you might also want to chip into this one. But looking specifically at what the risks and opportunities of broadening the just transition concept beyond the low carbon transition and the shift away from fossil fuels to the wider societal challenges that you mentioned, Edouard.
The risks, I mean, I don't really see any. I really think it's really fundamental because actually, as I said, I mean, if you look back in history at early efforts to push through a just transition, they were already including a range of different justice dimensions. Even looking, if we focus on the US, if you look at the history even of the concept of environmental justice itself, it has an inherently strong kind of racial justice dimension within it, embedded within it. So I think that that's again why I feel it's so important to really look back as well when we are before looking forward. I think there's just so much to learn from the history of this concept, and because, as I say, I think I kind of see. I think that it's very positive to see so many actors taking on the just transition concept and using it and replicating it, because it does show an interest in the social dimensions of the low carbon transition. But at the same time, I also see a risk, a potential risk of stripping it from those very communities who have been carrying it for so long. So it is really important to reroute the concept and to constantly reroute it in order to meaningfully move forward and in order to have this more holistic approach of what a just transition could actually look like.
Thanks. Patrick, would you come in on that same question or add to any
Sure.
of the panelists' contributions there?
Sure. I'd pretty much agree with Edouard. I was going to disagree with him, but he came back and changed his point, which is that I think that there is a risk, even though just transition, is born out of those, that labor movement, and a more kind of militant history. Really, it is like any concept; it can be disarmed of that. It can be co-opted. It can be defanged, I guess, and we've seen that with lots of terms. And so I think that there is a risk if it is applied so widely and by certain kinds of actors and certain kinds of agendas, it can lose that force. I would say though that where it does have where it can be applied more widely, and this is something that I wanted to introduce maybe to the discussion, is that it did come out of those labor histories in North America. And, for the most part, our conversation today has been, understandably, NESC and the EEAC has been around Europe and North America. But I think that it is important to think again, going back to my very first point, about global supply chains and our global economy. And so when we think about just transitions here, we also have to think about how that might be an unjust, transition or process somewhere else. So, for example, we think about the tech industry and, data-driven solutions and, the internet ever since sort of ecological modernization in the 90s in Europe. But, what we don't think about is the footprint of those technologies, whether it's wind turbines or electric vehicles. They're involved with extractive activities, mining. They are still carbon intensive. Data centers are the factories of today, the automobile industry of today. But it doesn't get as much attention because the focus is on peat, coal, combustion engines. But data centers are a colossal use of fossil fuels and produce huge emissions. And it's that idea of not outsourcing the problem, that we try and solve the problem in Europe and North America, but we outsource the problem to other parts of the world. And I think that global sort of justice perspective is a really important one to, keep front and center.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Patrick. Raphael, could you pick up on any of those points?
Yeah, I think that global justice point is very good, and within the various climate and environmental agreements, currently developed nations are not reaching the target. I think they had a target of around 100 billion in terms of low carbon technology and transfer. They're not meeting that, but I think there is a responsibility of developed nations to show the path forward for this just transition to low carbon economy. And for me, let's say going back to one of the points earlier, I think in terms of energy and climate change, we really need top-down leadership. We don't have a lot of political leadership on these issues. You can just look at the decision-making in the US on, appointing someone to the Supreme Court who in essence doesn't agree with climate change. I mean, doesn't agree with 97% of scientists all over the world. So this is the challenge we're facing. That's where we need top-down leadership. But in terms of the risks you mentioned, in terms of a just transition to a low carbon economy, I think the big risk is at a local level. We do need people to change their behavior, how we incentivize that. And I just give two examples, and they connect with the issue Patrick raised in terms of global supply chains. I walk into the street here during these COVID-19 times, the only shop that has a queue outside, going back nearly 500 meters or a mile is Primark. That's fast fashion. That is polluting heavily Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc. And we have to remember that these countries are also suffering in an extreme way from climate change. Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, 28 million people in the greater capital will be underwater by 2050. All these things are linking in together. And in terms of, we think about food. I'm over here living as an Irish person in the UK. I'm a bit worried perhaps about Brexit, but what worries me even more is the food issue. And I don't know if you heard the story of the UK maybe buying lots of delightful chicken from the US. How can, the US producers sell chicken cheaper than the producers in the UK, and bearing in mind that they have to transport it in boats, etc., with CO2 emissions going off? I mean, to me, that is mystifying in terms of, there's clearly regulations being missed, etc., etc. But, how do we encourage consumers to buy local, to, conserve, let's say, their clothes, etc.? And we really need to, in that way, reflecting back earlier as Patrick's point, we do need to think about some bottom-up solutions. And I think maybe the bottom-up ones are much more challenging. It's far easier to target the big things going on. Thanks. There is a report saying that 90 multinational companies are responsible for 2/3 of the world's CO2 emissions. If I'm looking at that stat, I think change is very achievable.
Thanks, Raphael. And that is a good point to end on. I think you've all really brought us back to the global perspective, which is really important. My thanks to all of you, Edward, Patrick, Alice, Charles, Sandrine, and Raphael. Thanks for all of your contributions. We've run out of time. I especially want to thank President Higgins for his contribution too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was a great end to the session. I think it's really important to bring home the global perspective when we're talking about a just transition, even here at home in Ireland. My take-home messages from all of this were about all the examples that we have to draw on from around the world and the need for change, both top-down and bottom-up. Larry, what were your take-home messages from the sessions?
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I mean, precisely that I think was really interesting, and it came through in this last session that we need a really strong combination of top-down and ambition at that level. And, it was very specific in that session about assessing subsidies, really looking at well-being indicators and how they can be used, infrastructure investment in cities, how cities are financed, all those top-down. But also then we need more ambition at the bottom up. How do we sort of get more of that? But I think, and I think the councils have a key role in this, it's the conduit between the two that's critical. Because if we get too, top down gets ahead of the bottom up, it won't land. If the bottom up feels it's not connected with what's happening, if, asks are being made of citizens to move around cities in different ways and they don't understand how that links in, we get resistance. So the councils do sit in an interesting place between sort of bottom up and top down, and I think we can do more in terms of facing upwards to the EU institutions. But also I think we have a responsibility to try to work with our members and it varies across the different interests in society and try to connect with the bottom up, so be that conduit. So I think it was really, the whole 3 days have been really very, very useful for me personally, I think, in terms of how NESC will move forward, but I think for the wider network also. So I really would like to thank everybody who's participated and for yourself, Cara. I think you've been absolutely fantastic over the 3 days and keeping us moving. So thank you very much.
It's been lovely to have your company, Larry, I have to say. Thanks for that. It's now time to draw the 28th annual conference of the EEAC network to a close. Many people, as Larry said, have helped make this week a success, including all of the NESC team, Sinead Kidder, Paula Henley, Jean Moore and Edna Jordan and Michiel de Vries at the EEAC, all amazing organisers. And of course, Verve, all of this would be impossible without the incredible production of Verve, making it online, recording everything for you to watch later if you like. So I hope you agree. It's been a raging success for the last 3 days. I'd like to formally introduce the chair of the EEAC network to close this session, Arnaud Carrault-Bassa. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing your final comments.
So thank you, Cara, and thank you. I second the word of gratitude especially by Larry. I mean, I would finish with very big thanks to all of you, but I think that all of you expect some more words. So let me make a reflection. We can look back at this conference that providing, at least for me, inspiring ideas and insights. I mean, they have been presented by a variety of renowned speakers, and especially I would like to highlight outline the speech by His Excellency President Michael Higgins. It has been a really inspiring contribution that I will try to listen again if it has been recorded. It was really important. Besides these contributions, the conference proved to be an excellent forum for sharing perspective, experiences, and practices. And I hope, and I think that the EAC hopes that you agree that over the past 3 days, we have built a common understanding and concrete strategies for making progress towards a just transition. Not hindered by the by now well-known limitations of meeting online, we together were able to shape a learning environment in which not only successes were shared, but also lessons learned, as well as remaining hurdles and challenges, and this is important. I highly value this kind of honest exchange, and I'm therefore grateful to NESC for providing us with a virtual space where this was possible. Larry, thank you. After this conference, I feel strengthened in my opinion that the task of managing the impacts of the ongoing transition in a just manner is an incredibly important but also complex task. In this perspective, I endorse the importance of social dialogue as a foundational element of a just transition. This conference will also stay with me because the artistic intermediaries, the music, poetry, and image gave this conference so emotion, really. And emotion is something that comes with and belongs to a transition. I heard a respected colleague saying that we should not shy away from emotions in our search for a just transition, and I could not agree more. So, colleagues, friends, I conclude from Barcelona by checking all the speakers, the moderator, Cara, and the team who jointly realized this successful conference. It was highly informative, timely, and topic, and we will use the insights gained over the past 3 days to strengthen our advice to our government and parliament. I thank you all very much on behalf of the entire EEAC network. I invite you to join the next annual conference in Barcelona next year, and please stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnaud. I really like that. Our motion belongs with the transition. I might have to actually take that home with me. There's been a lot of learning this last 3 days and a lot of work to do going forward. All of the recordings will be available on the NESC.ie website at the end of the week, thanks to Verve. We hope all of you at home have enjoyed and learned from the last 3 days, and we wish you all the best of luck and support in making the just transition wherever you are in this beautiful world. Thank you very much.